Hi, I'm Ed Marsh. Thanks for joining me today for this episode of Signals from the OP. Today we're going to talk about what I believe is a really important strategic issue that many manufacturers aren't even aware they have. A broken sales structure. What do I mean by that? Well, let's back up and let's understand the context. I often discuss a disconnect that I think manufacturing companies have between the way they manage their back end and the front end. So in other words, the back end of the business, the manufacturing, the operations is very rigorously managed. There's processes in place, there's scientific approaches, there's Lean, there's Six Sigma, there's an instinctive and explicit and deliberate understanding of every aspect of the business and very careful management of it. In contrast, the front end, the revenue growth side of the business, is treated very differently. It's a much more casual approach, much less scientific. You say, what's the sales gonna be next year? Well, maybe this year plus 5%. How are you gonna get there? Oh, maybe we'll add another sales rep, do another trade show. We'll figure something out. The business grows that way. So there's a real dissonance between the two. There's a kind of an analogous dissonance between the way companies sell and the way their buyers want to buy. Now, where does this come from? Well, it's hardly news that the buying journey has changed and the internet's changed it. So it used to be that there was asymmetrical information. Sellers had the information, buyers wanted the information, so buyers had to deal with sellers to get it. And buyers were kind of subject to the ideas that happened to hit them, either through associations, through interaction with people in business organizations, or maybe even through cold calls, where a salesperson would come in and say, hey, I see what you're doing, I've got a better way of doing it. So a buyer would kind of go along getting a little bit better every day, gradually aware of some issues they had, things they'd like to improve, problems they have. When it became clear they needed to do something, they'd perhaps ask for some suggestions, they'd figure out what the right solution was, and then they'd go to some sort of a directory. Could be the yellow pages, could be that big wall full of green books that I'm sure we saw in many people's offices back in the day, and they'd look for some vendors. They'd summon, 3 of them in, 5 of them in, something like that, and they would start saying, this is what I want, this is the solution, the product or service, tell me what you got, and there'd be a discussion about features, benefits, and price. That's the way people used to buy. And that's the way companies are set up to sell. With a small PR department, a small marketing department that typically has responsibilities for trade shows, and we call it marketing, but really it's more like advertising, bingo cards in direct mail and maybe some magazine ads. Field sales and sales channel, and then some sort of a success function, call it customer service. But buyers today have a very different approach. Buyers today will come up with an idea. They'll be sitting in traffic. They'll be driving home at the end of a day. They'll come out of a staff meeting and have a new directive. You have to figure out how to blank, blank, blank. And so they'll begin to search. They'll turn to Google. They'll ask Google questions. And they'll begin a journey, which is hardly linear. We kind of show it in a linear way, but it's all over the place. In fact, it starts very early sometimes, and then there's long breaks, and then they come back to it. And it's a very non-linear buying journey, if you will. But buyers go and do this research, they educate themselves, and then eventually they reach the point where they're ready to talk to a sales rep. So there's a couple statistics that I love to cite to try to put this all into context. 3%. Only 3% of the potential buyers for any given product or service are in the market at any given time. Only 3% of the potential buyers for any given product or service are in the market at any given time. Now, statistically, some people say there's maybe 20 or 30% that are open to it if they're aware of it or think about it or happen to kind of have the bandwidth to consider it. But the point is, if this is your total addressable market, only a small percentage is actively thinking about it, and a relatively small percentage is even open to it. 93% of all B2B purchases originate with an online search. 93% of all online purchases, B2B, originate with an internet search. Buyers are 70% of the way through their buying journey before they want to talk to a sales rep. Now, some people say 67%, some say 90%, but nobody says it's like it used to be. Buyers have done most of the work. They've defined their problem, they've understood their issue, they've got ideas on how they could fix it, they understand several different solutions, they've identified some potential vendors for each possible solution, and now they're ready to talk to a sales rep. And 74% of the time, buyers select the vendor that first provided value as they were trying to understand their problem and quantify a solution. 74% of the time, buyers select a vendor that first provided value, not the cheapest, not the most features, not the first to respond, those that provided the first value. So the point is that during this buying journey, there's an extensive self-service portion of the buying. This isn't news to anybody. Obviously, there's research, there's internet research, they're checking reviews, they're reading documents, they're downloading documents, they're watching videos, they're trying to understand how people have solved problems like theirs, what the kinds of solutions are that they could avail themselves of, and what sample vendors or what the best vendors might be for each of those solutions. What that means, though, is that we've got this disconnect that I'm talking about. So companies are structured with this traditional sales model. Not only are they structured this way, but obviously organizational headcount and resources and perception of kind of authority in the organization, et cetera, all go along with that. So we see that buyers don't want to talk to a sales rep, but companies are determined that they need to. So that creates a conflict. It creates a disconnect. It creates sales forces creating lots of quotes that never get opened or read or never get followed up on. I hear more and more from companies about how they're doing more quotes than they've ever done, but they're not even hearing back. They're not losing orders, there's just no decisions. The status quo is winning business. Well, that's because the salespeople have accountability. They're being measured by how many calls and meetings and quotes they're doing. People aren't interested in quotes. Then we have a situation where the buyers want to have a short, productive interaction with salespeople, which traditionally ends up being field salespeople or sales channel in the industrial manufacturing space. But there's this period here when they're doing research, when they're not saying we won't interact with a company, they're saying they don't want a field sales rep pestering them, how many you want to order, what did you have approved budget, etc. They want somebody who's going to help them understand their problem and fix it. A good way to understand this is if you think about when you go to a website and you submit a chat request for a company, do you submit the chat request saying, oh, I've got a technical service question, only technical service should answer this, or I've got a question about a product, only sales should answer this, or I want a brochure, only marketing should answer this? No, of course not. You go to the company expecting that you're going to have some sort of a continuum of a relationship with them from the time you're thinking about it and asking about it to the time you're trying to buy it, and later on when you're trying to use it, or maybe even thinking about buying more or reordering. You've got a relationship with the company, not with some sort of a siloed department. So we end up with this clear mismatch between the way companies staff their revenue growth and the way buyers want to buy. And what's interesting is if you talk to many companies that staff this way, they'll tell you that they want to buy this way. So it's not just, buyers from a different industry that have a different circumstance or context. These are the same companies that think about their world myopically the way they have, and then go out and buy and want to buy the way buyers increasingly buy. But so what does this mean? This means, obviously, that revenue growth becomes a CEO responsibility, and not just in the traditional buck stops here kind of a way, but in a very practical way. Because we're talking about implications to budgets, to headcount, to organizational clout. If we've got a VP of sales and a director of marketing, and neither of them is going to be in charge of their fiefdom going forward, if we're going to have a chief revenue officer that develops a staff with a continuum of skills, sure, PR skills are different than customer service and tech support skills, but we need people that are blended, that have responsibility, that can fill in when somebody's out, that can answer the chat regardless of what department they're in. And so that means that the staffing has to be done differently, but more importantly, there's tremendous change management and philosophical work that has to be done. We're not talking just about, can we cut a salesperson loose to spend a half an hour sitting with marketing to work on a blog post? We're talking about changing the way we approach and view and deal with customers. So that's why I put this in the context of a big strategic challenge that many manufacturers haven't quite fully wrapped their minds around and haven't begun to work on. And I think it's a big task for CEOs, and I think it's a task that boards need to be aware of, need to be thinking about, need to be asking about when they look at revenue results. I think they need to ask, what's the plan not only to get the number next time, but how are you structuring to do it? How are you addressing the fact that buyers are changing the way they buy? If you enjoy this kind of a provocative look at some of these big strategic issues that challenge manufacturers today, I'd welcome you to subscribe to this series of videos. You can do that at signalsfromtheop.com. Signalsfromtheop.com. OP is observation post, in case you're wondering. So I'm Ed Marsh. Thanks very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure. See you next time.